everybody, I'm Štěpán. Most of you apparently already know me, which is pretty insane. I'm not much of a speaker, so I have this all written down and I'll just be reading it to you. Since we're the Natural Law Institute, the obvious first thing to explain is natural law. This concept is by no means unique to us, and many of you may be familiar with it from others, perhaps most famously Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas himself, building from a work of the ancients as well as theologians that preceded him, explained that law isn't just a command imposed by an arbitrary outside authority, but an ordinance of reason of a lawmaker interested in the good of the community. He further disambiguates the law into eternal law, which is divine providence governing the universe as a whole, natural law, consisting of how rational creatures partake in the eternal law by acting according to its natural inclinations, to its proper acts and ends. Here Aquinas references Romans 2:14. Gentiles who have not the law do by nature those things that are of the law. And finally, human law, which is legislation that either conforms to the natural law or else is a perversion of law. In line with this, commandments in the scripture were reframed from commands to be obeyed without questioning to laws designed with rational ends in mind, God to ceasing to be an authoritarian and instead becoming a lawmaker. When this project was started, there was no intention to justify Aquinas, nor do we share his metaphysical presuppositions. None of us on the staff are explicitly believing Christians. We stick to science, and yet Aquinas is worth mentioning because the result of our work ends up looking very similar. So what's our interpretation? For starters, definition of law needs to encompass all laws, from laws of physics up to laws of civilizations. As such, law is nothing but a principle that allows for accurate predictions based on available information and attempts to explain the causality. For instance, law of gravity allows us to predict from mass of an object and its distance from other objects and their mass how its trajectory will be affected. Natural law can be considered a set of behavioral and social laws inherent to humans and their evolutionary niche, and exactly what social science would be producing if it was in fact a science and not a seditious ideology. Likewise, they could be called laws of cooperation or laws of morality, putting an end to any notion of moral relativism. Natural law tells us that contrary to misapplication of the notions of free will, blank slate and individualism, people have a nature of their own just like every other animal has its nature. That we can have expectations about how people will respond to what's being done to them, that they cannot be molded according to what ideologues think they should be like, and that the system of governance that is to persist must accommodate it, more so if the population it is supposed to be governing is to persist, improve and prosper over time. Exactly what Aquinas says about human law. I presume none of this is particularly revolutionary to this audience, even these that are new to our work. Unfortunately, natural law gets invoked by various ideologues to justify their worldview and preferences as well, so we must delve into specifics. Our explanation is materialistic. All laws of nature are emergent properties of evolutionary computation. This is a general term for how we describe changes of state occurring step by step, resulting in order emerging out of chaos by means of particles forming stable relations, such as atoms joining into molecules or people into cooperative relationships, and these relationships then themselves becoming particle in higher order interactions. In the process we call continuous recursive disambiguation. Likewise, order descends back into chaos by opposite means. For a relation to be stable, it must survive pressures of its environment, which includes competition with other relations. Hence, stable forms that these relations have to take emerge. An eagle must not deviate too far from the eagle form if it's to survive the pressure of its evolutionary niche. Essentially, it's a synthesis of Newton, Darwin, and Turing. It's also, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of eternal law of Aquinas. The laws, as we said, explain causality of interactions at every level of this complexity, from physical all the way to civilizational and potentially beyond. In context of evolutionary computation, cooperation is the stable relation we are concerned with at the interpersonal, social, and civilizational levels. Side note, this isn't a dogma that we require everyone to go along with. If your understanding of natural law is that it comes from God, whether as a designer or enforcer, that's not something to split hairs over. Significant part of our following is religions, and we have no intention of taking it away from them. The real question is whether we can agree what the law actually is. Our common enemies are largely those that reject the very notion of natural law to justify their parasitism and pretense of virtue. Natural law can be said to encompass all human behavior, but we are not here to describe all of it. That is likely both beyond our ability and the time we have available here. Especially after... I guess I've just given you license. Some of the concepts, however, have turned out to be extremely significant. Naturally, we first need to answer why would humans, or for that matter anything else, even cooperate in the first place? And why would cooperation then be a stable relation? The answer is that, like every organism, humans need to acquire, and cooperation with division of labor can potentially yield much higher returns for individuals involved, reduces risk, and opens new opportunities. None of us may be able to hunt mammoths alone, but we have an opportunity to do it together, and by enough of us working together, we increase a chance we all survive and eat more than we could trying to hunt on our own. This then automatically creates a second pressure in that those who try to work alone will not even be able to compete with cooperative groups. What this tells us is, among things, that state of nature of all against all that philosophers used to make their points could have existed at no point of human history, and the choices were being a member of a tribe or getting rolled over by one. Here we run into the criminal and the free rider problem. The members of a tribe are incentivized to make sure as much of the benefits go to them as possible, while disregarding success of other members by either reaping the profits without contributing or outright stealing. This makes cooperation less valuable. A pressure for other members to punish or remove such individuals emerges to restore the value of cooperation. We call this altruistic punishment because some members are taking on the cost of punishing others for the benefit of the whole group. The threat of punishment is either sufficient for members to behave themselves, but if not, punishment will teach them a lesson, or still failing that, take away their access to the group and to their genetics from the gene pool, whether by exile or death, which thus produces an evolutionary pressure against that kind of behavior. We to see how an idea of morality and justice evolves, and with it, people specialized in deciding it, experienced elders of the tribe, and administering it. As the tribe scales up to a large society, incentive emerges for its sovereign to ensure justice is maintained across it, to prevent retaliation cycles that devalue his holdings and decrease competitiveness of his subjects. And so altruistic punishment gets formalized as rule of law. Judicial process involves a process of discovery of truth, something that Europeans would later turn onto the natural world as a scientific method. Advancements in law are made through precedents. We must go over concepts that matter the most in the context of justice. First one we need to mention is demonstrated interest. This started out as a generalization of the idea of property, with clear observation that set of things humans fight for, defend, maintain, or otherwise invest in consist of far more than physical things in their possession, including time, attention, body, health, physique, knowledge, skills, relationship, reputation, privacy, family, friends, opportunities, as well as common interests, including territory, institutions, infrastructure, aesthetics of the commons, culture, faith, traditions, norms, and even gene pool. Note that this is a purely empirical statement, and any attempt to dismiss any of these as somehow illegitimate is purely ideological. Which of these are respected depends on the demands of the environment and on the culture, and what kind of compromise between all these people are willing to make. The respect for and protection of both private property and the commons is uniquely Western, as is willingness to tolerate others taking opportunities if they use them more productively. Reciprocity depends upon demonstrated interests in that it consists of the categories we demand reciprocity over. We recognize every loss caused by somebody else and involuntary exchange of any demonstrated interests as an imposition, which is to say, provocation of demand for restitution and retaliation. On top of that, if an exchange isn't productive, if the due diligence isn't performed and the other party exhaustively informed of all costs and risks that they need to be aware of, and if warranty for restitution, repair or replacement isn't provided, we still consider the exchange as potentially reciprocal. Vitally, any form of baiting into hazard is reciprocal. Recognizing all this reveals all kinds of presently legitimized behavior on the grounds of every party acting voluntarily, such as pharma baiting into addictions and universities baiting people into debt for useless degrees. Truth. There's of course the notion of ideal truth, basically referring to reality itself. This is not directly accessible to us, and so we only speak of performative truth as a quality of speech. It is testimony that satisfies the demand for infallibility and whether that speech is therefore reciprocal. We have a long list of criteria to test against, including obvious ones like logic and empirical correspondence, others less obvious like operational possibility and parsimony. In proposed exchanges, we test reciprocity of those. This certainly doesn't mean there's a need for everyone to speak in testimony all the time, even outside of court. Court.
Wait, what? Start saying that over again correctly.
That was a weird Freudian slip. But it can serve as a test of truthfulness. Truth-telling by default, regardless of cost, is another aberration of Western civilization, specifically of European men. Responsibility is something almost everyone seeks to evade, but figuring out who's capable of bearing responsibility, who is willing to do so, and then who actually is responsible for outcomes of any given situation and whether they accept it, is vitally important in the context of law, as you'd expect. Agency is another relevant concept. It's what we used to mean by free will before philosophers turned it into nonsense. It breaks laws of physics, which is the extent to which one is in control of their thoughts, actions, and outcomes of those actions. It's how we determine capability for responsibility. Automatic assumption of full adult agency of everyone age 18 or 29 has been demonstrably wrong. Both responsibility and agency are also context-dependent. We have different levels of agency in and responsibility over different things. Nonetheless, we also observe general agency and general willingness to bear responsibility that influences every area of life. Trust is what emerges when we can reasonably expect others behave reciprocally within some cultural and normative expectations and being responsible for their own behavior, or at least someone else being responsible for their behavior, such as with children. We consider trust a form of capital because time and resources that would either be lost due to irreciprocity or insurance against it and other unexpected behavior can be instead spent productively. A famous example is the shopping cart theory, where a demonstration of high-trust society is people returning carts for no individual benefit to themselves. Bigger example is white privilege, which is one of those examples where woke is more correct than the mainstream. Whites get treated better in many scenarios simply because they can reasonably be expected to behave themselves well, and every white individual who doesn't abuse this and continues behaving well despite opportunity to do otherwise could be said to be investing into this privilege. That's the paradox that won't tell you, of course. Furthermore, maintaining cooperation requires we also maintain lower order stable relation. It may sound absurd to even have to point out that we cannot maintain cooperation while trying to break laws of physics, but our current system runs on the assumption of infinite growth, which contradicts conservation of energy. Leftist political ideologies tend to quite explicitly assume post-scarcity age would arrive or is already here, and that as such competition for scarce resources is no longer necessary or inevitable. But conservation of energy still applies. Gains from every new discovery and technology will eventually run out, and if we assume otherwise, we'll run into a wall. Similarly, we can maintain cooperation while going against the laws of evolution. If we want a nation of cooperative and trustworthy people, we need to maintain selection pressure for that kind of people. The rather obvious example of doing it wrong is paying people who don't work child support, resulting in a growing number of people with a genetic tendency not to work. Likewise, if we tax smart rich people to support lifestyle of not so smart poor people to the extent the latter has more kids, it follows the population will get dumber over time. This just isn't sustainable, and the least we can do about this is prevent criminals from reproducing and condition welfare on staying below replacement rate. Furthermore, because ethnocentric cooperation beats every other strategy as shown both by evidence and computer models, there can be no policy demand that individuals act against their ethnic interests without being identified as an unlawful attack on that ethnic group rather than law for their benefit. It is also why homogeneous populations achieve best results in terms of trust, communal life, and mutual charity, all other things being equal. These concepts may perhaps not sound very groundbreaking, but strict and consistent application of them in rule of law and consequently in limitations of other branches of government would quickly start revealing that it's full of criminals, outlaws, traitors, and infantile people that don't belong anywhere near power, as well as legislation that is unlawful.
You're going to be subtle, Mark.
Why would you think that? It would put an end to immigration of what's slave labor in all but name, whether legal or illegal, to anti-discrimination laws in any form, any limitations of freedom of association beyond necessary transit, all parasitic redistribution, privatization of commons, socialization of losses, letting irredeemable criminals back on the street, let alone turning them into martyrs, to any policy that disincentivizes formation and stability of families, allying and sedition in media and academia, lobbying from special interest groups, to universal franchise and conflation of citizenry with residency. In short, it would put an end to civil rights law, to leftism in general, and to many issues with the so-called capitalism as well.
That's actually really important. Can you just emphasize that one again? Just say it again and explain what you mean.
I mean, capitalism, as it gets defended, relies basically on only being concerned with voluntary exchanges and disregard for all other factors of reciprocity. It enables parasitism in all sorts of ways. What we'd end up with is law that is actually for the good of the community, guaranteeing both individuals and groups self-determination by self-determined means, reciprocity in display, word and deed in all demonstrated interests, with speech to the public and matters public warranted against error, bias, deceit, and baiting it to hazard, and from this emerging markets in association, cooperation, production, reproduction, commons, dispute resolution, and polities. We would have commons with functions and aesthetics appropriate for our needs, power to deny power to all those who seek it while evading associated responsibility. This would result in fastest possible perpetual adaptation known to man at genetic, cognitive, cultural, and technological levels. The only reason anyone would oppose this are ignorance, virtue signaling within context of immoral ideology, or outright trying to preserve their means of criminality. Thank you.